Having people buy into the mission of the company, take ownership of a project, be all into the purpose, that is, one of the most critical things. You can only get that if they feel like they're really contributing, showing them the impact that they're having on patients, even if it's something small. But I think it really energizes people. It makes them feel like they're having a strong impact.
You're listening to Talent Therapy. Here, you'll find discussions with biotech and pharma leaders around talent and recruiting trends, market insights, and leadership philosophies, so that you and your team are informed around an array of industry perspectives. And now, your host, Chris Tamburini.
All right, Jay Baum, welcome to the Talent Therapy Podcast. It's great to have you. For the audience who's listening, Jay is a CSO in the biotech industry, and I will let him introduce himself and give a formal explanation of his background.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here today. I appreciate you having me on. As you mentioned, my name is Jay Baum. I've been in the life sciences industry for about 20 years now, which is kind of hard to believe that it's been that long already. So I originally did my PhD at Boston University. I worked on cell death pathways, actually in Drosophila or fruit fly ovaries, which is probably not your typical path for a career in industry. My first job in industry was actually at an antibody company called Cell Signaling Technologies, where I was able to get a great foundation on understanding cancer signaling pathways, protein engineering, antibody production. I think all of those things have been really critical throughout my career. But even early on, I had a very strong interest in oncology drug development. And at that time, there was a company called Pharmaceuticals that was an up and coming company taking a somewhat unique look at a systems biology approach to treating cancer. So rather than looking at an individual target or an individual node, it was more of a holistic approach on how cancer cells can use fairly complex systems to try to evade blockade by a drug. And Merrimack was one of those companies that very early on was looking at pathway redundancy and the rationale for developing bispecifics. They were one of the first companies to really work on bispecific antibodies to be able to hit multiple targets or multiple pathways at once. But I think most important for me, that experience at Merrimack was really where my passion for translational work took off. So we knew very early on at Merrimack in our programs there that not every patient was going to respond to the therapies we were developing. One issue we had specifically with a program that I was working on was that there were no great diagnostic tests to be able to test a predictive marker that we thought was critical at that time. And so one of the philosophies that I strongly believe in is if there are no good tools to solve a problem, go ahead and create it. And Merrimack was very supportive of this. So as a scientist at the bench, I developed an assay to measure the protein we were interested in, developed it in as a blood test, worked with different CROs to transfer it to a more regulated environment and get it ready for clinical use and initiated discussions with the FDA. And eventually we were able to implement that test that I developed at the bench into our clinical study to be able to prospectively select patients. So, that experience of creating something new that I think could benefit patients and sort of the learning by doing. I extended that to other programs at Merrimack, that also required a diagnostic test for patient selection. And that allowed me to sort of pave the way for an eventual role there leading the clinical biomarkers and diagnostics. That approach of really trying to target the patients that we believe were most likely to respond to the therapy rather than treating everyone, including patients you knew wouldn't respond, really just ignited a great interest in me. And so about after 6 years or so at Merrimack, an opportunity came up to go to Novartis to lead the precision medicine efforts there in lung cancer. Obviously, making that transition from 100 or so person company to 130,000, is a pretty daunting jump. But I think it, really allowed me to work on a lot of different programs and trials at once, eventually across a wide range of diseases. So, not just oncology, but ophthalmology, cardiology, neuroscience, I&I, you name it. So, I was able to take what I really loved about precision medicine and oncology and expand it to those areas. And, in addition, while my focus had largely been early stage to preclinical at Merrimack, I was able to, at Novartis, use that opportunity to experience the later stages of drug development. So I was really fortunate to be part of a successful drug and companion diagnostic series of approvals. But that 4 years in Novartis was amazing. There were so many of the lessons that I learned there that I continue to use every day. Not just that experience of working on a lot of molecules or trials at once, but really how to work collaboratively across large global teams, across different countries and time zones, taking innovative approaches to drug development and learning how to be that balanced leader on both the science and the people side. So, fast forward to 2020, right in the middle of COVID, the opportunity came up with Leap Therapeutics. Leap was at a really critical stage in its development as a company. They had a very promising clinical asset that required a strong translational strategy to really target the patients that were most likely to respond. And, that was something that I had developed that passion for. So I felt I could help them to successfully navigate that space as well. During my tenure at Leap, I'm really proud of the work that we've done to help cancer patients across different indications. We've recently completed two randomized phase 2 trials there with critical translational components. At Leap, I also had the opportunity to expand the pipeline through acquisitions to help convert the company from a single drug company to one of multiple assets and took on the CSO role there as well to be more out-facing role as well as the science. So Leap today has taken on a new focus, now known as cypherpunk technologies, around cryptocurrency treasury strategy. That could probably be a whole separate podcast that I don't want to go into today. But we still strongly believe in the therapies that we were developing there, and I'm continuing to try to help them get to patients. While continuing to explore what I want to do as my next full time role. So I'd say finally, as anyone who knows me well knows, I strongly believe in a healthy work-life balance. And so outside of work, I love, watching my kids compete at sports. We're a very big basketball family, so I spend a lot of time in gyms and occasionally even coaching as well when they'll let me. So, love to have that work-life balance.
That's awesome. I didn't realize. Well, first off, thank you for that introduction. I really appreciate that oversight and kind of your journey through working your way up to Leap most recently as a CSO. It's a really nice explanation, and I appreciate how you going through that. On a side note, I did not realize that you were into basketball with your kids. I also just took on coaching basketball for my youngest, my 7-year-old, which is more like herding cats than it is coaching, but it's really fun.
Yeah, completely agree. Fortunate enough to have an older son that's going to play in college next year and an eighth grader that, competes at a high level. So it's just a lot of fun to watch them.
Wow, that's fantastic. So, one of the things that I wanted to really ask you about, that I was really curious about, is specifically around, your leadership experience. You started off at smaller organizations, worked your way into larger organizations, maybe one of the largest organizations in Novartis, and then worked your way back into a smaller organization. And progressively, you have taken on leadership responsibilities. And so I would be curious, and I think the audience would be curious as to what your overall philosophy is on leadership and what some of the differences are when you're leading teams at larger companies versus leading teams in programs at smaller biotechs.
Yeah, great question, Chris. And maybe I'll start with the second part first about, some of the differences. So, I've loved recently being part of a small biotech. I think it suits my personality really well, my career goals, my interest in trying to build something and move quickly and have a direct impact on patients. But I also recognize that small biotech often moves very fast, maybe faster than big pharma. And, there's always the urgency to get to that next milestone, that next data point or fundraise. And unfortunately, I've seen some companies, thankfully not the ones that I've worked with, but others that, during these periods of stress can deprioritize what really matters. And, to me, that's people development. So this is something I think big pharma actually does very well. And much of what I practice today, I actually took from my experience at Novartis. So, when I went to Novartis, it was the start of a period for their new CEO, Voss, who brought in this idea of unbossing or servant leadership that I think is really important. And by this, I mean, putting a strong emphasis on empowering teams or creating a culture of curiosity where it's okay to challenge leaders, do it in a respectful manner, but it's okay to challenge leaders, and they should serve as a coach rather than a micromanager. We should practice empathy. We should really listen to those people on our teams. It can't just be this hierarchy where one person sends down instructions to those reporting to them. As a leader, you really need to be someone who serves the needs of the team and be accountable to them. So, you asked a little bit about my philosophy. I mean, I guess a couple of things that are important to me when I think about leadership. First one and maybe foremost is humility. I think over the years I've learned that one of the most important attributes a leader can have is being a humble person, having an open mind, being willing to take on new perspectives and even change your mind as new data emerges is really important. I've worked around a few people over the years who, quite frankly, have been arrogant, who think they are always right and, are not always open to the opinions of others. And I think nothing's more toxic to a successful work environment. Another area that's really important to me is making people feel like they're part of an environment that is a safe place. And by that, I mean where they can take innovative chances, which often lead to great success. But if they don't, and there is a failure, that's fine as long as we learn from those failures and don't repeat them in the future. So, I could think of an example when I was at Novartis. We took a drug right from cardiology study into 3 phase 3s in lung cancer. That was an extremely bold move to make that transition quickly. And unfortunately, it didn't work out, but we followed the science. We tried to get the novel medicine to patients as quickly as possible. And I think what we learned from that experience hopefully will allow us to be more successful or them to be more successful next time. So, learning from that failure. I can think of another example, even a little bit more personally of learning from failure. I mentioned early on when I was at Merrimack, I was working on a diagnostic test that I developed at the bench and moved into trials to select patients. I remember we started screening patients with that test, and the first couple weeks of that experience, everybody was screening negative. I mean, nobody was getting onto the study. Physicians were mad that their patients were not qualifying, and rightfully so. Those around me were starting to question the tests. I remember I had trouble sleeping. I was turning over every leaf looking at the data, trying to analyze it. And, long story short, we or I had selected the wrong cutoff in the test for who we considered positive versus negative, and we had to adjust it. And, I think it's something that I really learned from and impacted now how I approach similar situations in the future. So, and again, a great learning experience. I mean, we try to be perfect, but we can't be expected to always be perfect. If we were, our success rate in this business and getting approved drugs would be a lot higher. But I also recognize that patients are relying on us, and so we have to do the best we can to learn from those mistakes and avoid repeating them. Maybe one other point, when I think about leadership, I think regardless of, whether it is a big pharma or a small biotech or even a totally different industry outside of life sciences, there has to be this focus on people. I've spent a lot of time talking to founders, to VC companies, and when you ask them what the underlying factor is in successful companies, it always comes back to those people, the high performing teams. In my one on one meetings with my team, or even with people outside of my team, only a portion of that discussion is around objectives or day to day activities. I personally feel like if I hire these people, I can trust them to handle those goals without micromanaging. I'm always there if they need me, but a lot of our discussions are around what additional resources can I provide to you? Can we give real time feedback to each other? Can I help with the career development? So I think that's super important. And I'm always trying to encourage people, especially those early in their careers, not to temper that hunger and the passion they have, but really harness it. Make sure you get a seat at the table and speak up. It's again that idea of servant leadership or unbossing and encouraging or coaching. So, maybe to that end, if you ask me what I'm most proud of in my career, it's the people that I've been able to help and to some degree just play a small role in helping to coach them and see their careers take off. I love keeping in touch with people who I've worked with many years ago who may have been early in their careers at the time or considering a transition to a different function and are now leading a high performing team or getting medicines to patients, or maybe people who are great scientists but didn't know how to give a clear presentation and are now the key out facing person for their company. So, in addition to the impact that we have on patients, I would say helping someone's career trajectory, even a very small way, I think that's one of the most rewarding things for me.
Yeah, I mean, I love the philosophy. I identify with that. I mean, I think when it comes to being a servant leader, it's almost some might look at that as like an oxymoron. Like, oh, you're serving, but you're leading. But I do think it is the most fundamental way to lead is to provide surplus to the individuals that you're working with and create platforms and allow them to function freely and give them the resources that they need, give them the information that they need, but don't, like you said, micromanage them. And I think this was a question that came up in my mind as you were talking about, well, you don't micromanage. And I do think a lot of leaders, especially newer leaders, but not all the time, but a lot of leaders in general do what I would say, I'll use the word struggle with micromanagement, meaning they'll do it and it's innate. And I think a lot of people in leadership positions, and I'm speaking about kind of myself here too. Sometimes you become a control freak, right? And you want to have your fingerprints on everything and you want to make sure that everything's perfect. And in order to do that, the way that you compensate for it is you kind of default to micromanaging because it makes sure that you're involved. Was there a time in your career when you were leading that you found yourself being a micromanager? I feel like every manager or every leader probably has. I could be wrong, but I feel like that's probably happened for most leaders and managers. And if so, when did you decide to become more of a delegator versus micromanager or a provider versus a micromanager? Was there a time in your career that sticks out that is clear to you when you kind of made that transition?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it probably is in more of the when I, sort of when I made that jump to big pharma back to small biotech at Leap, as I said, there's always an urgency. Things are always moving quickly. You're sitting in meetings with your team, you're on a call with somebody and a question comes up and it's a question you can answer very quickly and move on, but you're surrounded by team members and my goal is for these team members to find their voice and develop their career. And if it takes a little bit of extra time to get to the answer, to allow them to provide the answer in a few minutes as opposed to me in 10 seconds, I'd rather spend that time because I think a lot of people along my way have been very supportive and helped me to find my voice. And that's one of the biggest things that I'm trying to do for people on my team is help them find their voice and give them opportunities to succeed. I don't think I would be where I am today if I didn't have people that supported me and gave me opportunities to succeed. So it has to be a very conscious effort. I think it's very easy to slip back, as I said, especially in the fast paced biotech. But I would say, if you keep that in mind, you keep people on your team in mind, at the forefront, I think it becomes more natural. But it is a transition, no doubt about it. It's always easy to slip into the micromanaging 100%.
Yeah, and I can see it happening more so in a really fast-paced small biotech environment where the accountability is through the roof. There's less resources, and generally there's less time. And so everyone's operating in a somewhat different pace than they would be at a large biotech. And as you said that, and actually a light went off in my head. I've worked at large companies, I worked at small companies, and I do think back and I think maybe in some of those smaller environments, I have been a little bit quicker to micromanage it at certain times. So this really ties into the whole concept of, coaching and providing feedback. And at a larger company, maybe you see feedback given in a more formal fashion. And maybe that's in the form of monthly reviews or weekly one-on-ones or quarterly reviews. And that's one way to do it. But there's a lot of time in between those meetings. And there's a formality to it. And maybe there's missed opportunities there. And then there's the other way, which is just providing real feedback, real-time feedback, on-the-spot feedback. And this is something that you and I kind of spoke about a little bit before separately, and the differences between those two philosophies. Would love to hear your thoughts on, providing real-time feedback versus waiting for some sort of formal review and what maybe the hurdles and obstacles are around both.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. This is a really important topic, and to be honest, I am always shocked when I hear people going into an end of year review, not knowing what to expect or being nervous about it. If a manager is doing their job, they should be providing real time feedback on a constant basis, but also asking for feedback from the people on their team. And this is not unique to life sciences. Again, this could be any industry, but if I see a way that somebody can improve their presentation skills, deal with a conflict or attack a problem, why would I wait till months down the road when they've potentially repeated the same problem multiple times? If I'm doing my job correctly, a review should really be a formality more than anything, and definitely not an unexpected surprise. But again, it has to go both ways. Managers and the people on their team should both be asking for feedback on a regular basis if they're not getting it. Don't just assume if you don't hear anything back that there's nothing you can improve on. But at the same time, I also think feedback, and we fall into this trap a lot where we consider feedback a way to give critique on how to improve. I think it's just as important if somebody's doing a good job to let them know in real time and celebrate that achievement. And I think, to be perfectly honest, this is something that I did not do very well at early on in my career. And I made the conscious effort to try to improve on this real time recognition. This goes beyond one on one meetings. I think if there are opportunities to highlight someone's accomplishments to leadership or in a broader company setting, go ahead and do it. I find this means more to people than checking a box at the end of a year review on a piece of paper that very few people will see. So, again, that feedback should be both constructive and positive and go both ways. I love to hear feedback from people on my team, and I encourage them if for some reason I don't give it often enough, please ask me. I think that's something I stated at the beginning. So yeah, extremely important.
Yeah. Do you feel that there's potential downfalls in giving real-time feedback? Meaning maybe it's a knee-jerk reaction from the person giving feedback, or do you feel that it's necessary to kind of keep that communication flowing? Just thinking about that because I can think about maybe some times where maybe I've said something and I'm like, yeah, maybe I should have thought that through a little bit more. But I also felt that it was important to say something, and maybe I should have worded it differently. But I don't know. You tell me.
Yeah, no, and I agree. It's very, circumstantial depending on the time and the place. If you're in a meeting with senior leadership and somebody on my team is there, yeah, I may not want to critique them in front of, the board or senior leaders. That may be something I want to save for after the meeting. But I also, and I have no problem with taking a little bit of time to think about it, but I also feel like it loses its message if you wait too long. And, a month down the road, you say, hey, remember that meeting we had back in, November? That one comment you made I thought was a little bit inappropriate and you could have handled it a different way. I just think it hits better if you do it closer to the event that happens. And, I think people respect it. I think we're all adults. And as long as you do it in a respectful manner, I think, everybody appreciates it. But again, at the same time, also do it on the positives. If you see someone that did a great job in a meeting, I like to immediately, acknowledge that. So I prefer more of the short-term real-time feedback, but I do understand that for certain people to get the words together and make sure the message is clear, it may be worth waiting a little longer.
Yeah. The positive feedback thing is really interesting. I think a lot of times when people think of the concept of giving feedback, whether it's real time or whether it's structured or scheduled, it tends to come with a constructive connotation. But you just spoke about positive feedback and kind of the benefits of that. I personally love giving positive feedback as long as it's genuine. And do you think from when you're kind of building a team and you're creating a culture and you're providing feedback, do you think that positive feedback weighs heavier than maybe some of the critical feedback? Or do you think some of the critical feedback is more important? This is kind of a gray topic, but it's an interesting concept, and I think there's a lot of different types of feedback you can give people, and I think positive feedback generally isn't given as much in the work environment as maybe it could be or should be. But I mean, what types of reactions do you think you have gotten from providing positive feedback to your team members in your groups?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, maybe it's a little different sometimes for a group of scientists who aren't used to getting it as much, who are, been in the lab a lot and aren't used to receiving some of the accolades. But I find it's as important or probably more important than giving the constructive feedback. Having people buy into the mission of the company, take ownership of a project, be all into the purpose. I think you can only get that if, they feel like they're really contributing to what we're delivering to patients, at least in the therapeutic companies. And so showing them the impact that they're having on patients, even if it's something small, even if it's you ran this preclinical study, we presented it to investors and investors really love it. They might be 3 layers away from that in the lab and not know the impact that it had downstream, but I think it really energizes people. It makes them feel like they're having a strong impact, not only on the future of the company, but on, a benefit to patients. And I think that is, one of the most critical things that tie into how people are, not just achieving their day-to-day goals, but really, making a difference for patients, even if it's, something as small as a preclinical study that helps to raise funds or helps a BD deal get done. And so to me, it's absolutely critical that you do that for all levels of people.
Yeah. The other thing that comes to mind is coupling positive feedback with constructive feedback and using that positive momentum to actually have a bigger impact on some of that constructive feedback. And so, if there are a lot of good things that are happening within the organization or with the team, I think it's really important to acknowledge those and then maybe preface that positive feedback with the constructive feedback. That way, it psychologically creates a real time picture of what's going on, and then it creates a little bit more motivation when it comes to the constructive feedback because it's coupled or partnered with something that is positive.
Yeah, and I can give you a little example of this. So I think, I mentioned some of the people that do a lot of the preclinical research or even clinical biomarker work. One thing that I feel like is extremely important is being able to present your work, to be out facing, to tell a clear and concise story. If you did the work, I don't necessarily want to be the one always presenting that. I want you to go out and present that. So a lot of times, a lot of my feedback is you've done this amazing work. But what I've seen is sometimes when you give a presentation, the message isn't as clear to everybody and you get a little bit distracted. Let's work together on how to give that clear and concise presentation with a strong message so that I'm not the one delivering this great work that you've done, but you can be the one who's out facing it and telling that story, whether it's to KOLs or investors or BD partners. And I think that does motivate people. So it's you've done great work here on the research side. Now let's work on the next piece, which is telling that story, which is a little bit more work in progress. And I think that's an example of a situation that I've had come up a few times, and I think people really appreciate that, especially down the road in their careers when they look back and they become a great storyteller. I think that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk about hiring for a minute and your take on that. As a CSO, as a scientific leader, you've had to hire and build teams throughout your career. And in recruiting and in hiring, I think there's a lot of things you look at, but if you're going to simplify things, you can break it down into really two areas: technical skills and accomplishments, the nuts and bolts, the X's and O's, and then the cultural fit. And I always say that this is a 50-50. This is what I do for a living. I'm recruiting people, and there's the technical component, and then there's the cultural and the personality component. And I think they're equally as important. That's my philosophy. But this is not about me. This is about you and your philosophy. And so I would love to hear, when you're hiring scientifically or clinically or medically, how are you weighing those things out? And how does that differ? And maybe it differs for different levels. If you're hiring a director versus maybe you're hiring a scientist versus maybe you're hiring a vice president. But how do you weigh that out? Because I have to imagine it's really challenging because you generally need both, right? You generally need both, especially if you're trying to build a culture. So would love your thoughts on hiring as a CSO or as an executive.
Yeah, and I don't know that it really there's anything very unique to hiring as a CSO versus, hiring in another role. But I completely agree that it is a balance in terms of what we look for. A patient can be the world's leading expert in a skill or an indication that we're looking for, but if they don't treat people with respect, or you get the sense they would put themselves above the enterprise needs of the company, we just can't bring them in. So in a new hire, regardless of the role that I'm in, I'm looking for somebody who is collaborative, who's willing to speak up, who's authentic, humble, curious, to keep learning. But I also want somebody who can bring something unique and innovative to the team, right? So something that we might be lacking. We don't usually hire just for the sake of hiring, especially in this environment. But there has to be a business need to gain a new skill set, or a new expertise. So, I think especially in this recent difficult job market, I have seen it change a little, and hiring managers are getting very specific. They're asking for a lot. Have you worked with a specific drug modality and a specific indication? So I don't know, maybe somebody will say, we're looking for somebody who has a deep expertise in oligonucleotides and inflammatory diseases, and conversations with the European regulators, right? Good luck finding that. Maybe you will these days. But to me, being able to check every box is not an absolute requirement when it comes to the experience they have. I'm more than happy to bring somebody in who has expertise in a function, but not necessarily the exact disease or drug type, especially if they're a great cultural fit. So, I can give you an example. About a year ago, I hired an awesome head of pharmacology to help with our oncology assets. This was both for pharmacology, programs in the clinic, as well as early stage programs that were moving towards IND. That person had actually never worked in oncology before, and we had other candidates with oncology experience, but I felt like their pharmacology experience was translatable across disease areas. They were authentic, a bold leader who I knew could bring new ideas to the table. I was willing to take some time to help teach them what they needed to learn in oncology. So, I know, again, especially today, there are people who are hesitant to apply to roles because they don't meet every single requirement. And again, there are of course some must-haves. But personally, I'd rather sacrifice on one or two experiences or skills to have somebody who's willing to learn, willing to work collaboratively, be courageous and bring new ideas to the table. And so, definitely it's a balance. And, as I touched on before, if it's somebody who is either able to communicate clearly or willing to take the time to learn to how to communicate clearly, I think that's even an additive thing that makes them really attractive. My goal is to invest in people who you want to see develop and help to grow their careers. It's not somebody to do a short-term job. If I can help them to coach them, whether, if that's through better presentation skills, or telling a story or something else, that's really important to me. And even if it doesn't help them in the current role that we're looking to bring in, and it might be something that helps them down the road grow their career, I would love to bring them in and help with that. And, but it's good to know that initially they at least have the interest and willingness to do that. So, long story short, definitely a balance, but absolutely willing to sacrifice some of the skills and experience for somebody who's a great cultural fit.
That's great. Speaking of culture, there's this phenomenon that happens within biotech, within pharma, and there's these buzz terms and these buzzwords, and there's like actually where the rubber meets the road. What do you think about that? Because I do believe there's a level of superficiality, if that's the right word, around some of these things, and would love your thoughts.
Yeah, I'll try to be careful here and really express how I feel about this. So as you heard me talk about earlier, I think organizations absolutely have to foster certain ingredients of a strong culture, whether that's collaboration or innovation, transparency, curiosity, all of these things. But as you alluded to, there is a difference between putting those words on a website or a bulletin board and actually practicing them. I've seen companies that have preached things like transparency and authenticity and putting people first. And then you hear about, friends of mine or candidates that have gone in during the hiring process, and they'll completely ghost a candidate who spent multiple days interviewing or giving a presentation with no feedback whatsoever. I just don't understand how you can ask a candidate to do the things that you don't practice yourself. There are companies that pretty much every company emphasizes collaboration. And then again, you hear about companies that allow people who maybe have been there for a decade or more and are kind of set in their ways to play by their own rules and put their particular teams or themselves ahead of the broader goal of the company. So again, I think buzzwords are nice, but the actual practice needs to come from the leadership top down. Demonstrating the company's values themselves and showing accountability is really important. I've already touched on some of those aspects of a great culture to me, maybe just to reemphasize some of the things that I think are really important that companies do in practice. That curiosity and that innovation. When companies give people the freedom to explore new ideas, that's how companies grow, that's how people grow. And if they fail, make sure they learn from that failure. Empathy, putting people first, putting yourself in someone else's shoes and understanding what they're dealing with as an employee and also as a person. And, we already talked about that aspect of servant leadership and empowering teams and supporting them instead of simply giving instructions. Leaders being accountable and being a coach instead of a micromanager, as we discussed. It's really important to make sure everyone's aware of the purpose and the mission and are working towards that common goal. But again, this has to be leading by example. It's not enough just to say, hey, we stand for these things. But then when push comes to shove, you fall back on some of the bad habits that do often emerge when a company is in a stressful or urgent situation. So, I guess what I'm saying is you can't just emphasize culture, culture, culture because we want to generate likes on a LinkedIn post. It has to be implemented throughout the organization and start with the leadership.
Yeah, it's really, I think, easy to come up with ideals, things that are sound nice, they look nice, and in theory are going to work nice. But it's really hard to consistently act upon them and execute upon them, especially in times of high stress and in high panic. People will revert back into survival mode, and it's a challenging thing. It's almost better for a company maybe to be transparent about some of their downfalls up front. I've talked about this with some other guests and just in general. Like, I think a company, maybe you don't put it on a website, right? But when you're having conversations with people when you're in house, you can really say, here's what we're aiming for. Do we do this all the time? No. Are we perfect? No. Are we trying to be perfect? We're trying to get there. Yeah. But are these ideals going to be executed every single day as an organization? No, they're not. But are we going to try to achieve them? Yeah. And I almost think that approach, just being totally realistic about things, would create potentially a better environment because when things do hit the fan, there could be maybe an exit or just like some understanding as to why things aren't going according to the ideals. Just a raw thought coming out of my mind. I just feel like I think it's realistic, right? I think it's realistic.
Absolutely. And then not only these are our potential shortcomings and where we want to go, but this is how we want you to help us get there. This is why we're hiring you because we think you fit in well to the maybe not this picture of perfection where we are now, but where we want to go. And your leadership, your ideas, your values are going to be important to get us there. And I think people would really appreciate that. And that would make them want to go work somewhere as opposed to somewhere where, there's this picture of being perfect and it's just not reality.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great point. Having individuals on that team help to achieve the ideal and creating an environment where they can push back and letting that be known that it's if they're seeing a situation where they're not where the company maybe isn't, practicing its ideals, well then an environment's been created where that person's talent and leadership can help get back on track. And so I really think that's a very realistic approach. So I'm happy you brought that up. I think one of the other things we wanted to talk about, which I think really just ties into everything we were just talking about, but maybe you have some additional thoughts here is being a scientific leader and a scientific thought leader versus being a people leader. And, I think you can look at that in two different ways. Maybe you don't. Maybe you incorporate it into one way. But I do think that there is, scientific strategy, scientific direction, endpoints, goals, data that you're trying to achieve. And that's a component of technical leadership. But then there's the people leadership. How do you meld the two? How do you bring the two together? And you actually explained this or started to, but maybe you have some additional thoughts there that we didn't touch on.
Yeah, I think especially in the research area, this is a great question because My background as a scientist, all the people on my team are largely scientists. Scientists love perfection. And, we would spend 5 years writing a perfect science or nature paper if we could, but that doesn't always align with the goals of the company where, you're trying to get to a fundraise, or you're trying to get the clinical data or enroll patients. And so, sometimes you have to help people to understand that we have to prioritize. We can't always do the 5-year perfect science paper. And sometimes, we have to, make sure we're putting our best foot forward. But I would say I think those two really go hand in hand, being a people leader and a science leader for the most part. As I mentioned before, I've had some great leaders that have helped me throughout my career. People have gone out of their way to support me, both on the science side and the personal development side. And so I feel an obligation to do the same thing for, not only people that are on my team, but across the organizations that I've worked on. So, when I do that, there are a couple things that I try to keep in mind. And so first, when I've sat down and really listened to people, the main thing that always comes up are honesty and transparency, especially around the flow of information. People don't want to be kept in the dark about company news or strategy. And obviously there are certain times where there's material information that has to be kept to a small group. But most of the time, there is information that can be shared and should be shared more broadly with the organization. And I think that makes people feel more connected to the mission of the company and more invested. And even if you say, we're having a little bit of trouble around fundraising, for example, most people are adults. They've been through the industry for a while and they can handle it. And they'd appreciate that honesty as opposed to saying, hey, everything's great. We're going to be fine. And then all of a sudden, you read a press release about how there are layoffs happening. Right. So that transparency is extremely important. Secondly, I think it's really important to keep an enterprise mindset. And I think this is, again, the connection between science and people leadership. As much as we would all try to move our projects forward, me as much as anyone, you have to be willing to ask, is that truly the best use of resources, or should other areas be prioritized? So, I could think of many examples of this, maybe one recently where I've strongly believed in a preclinical asset. I really believe this would add value to the company if we were to put resources in for the long-term future. But I also knew that in the short term, the future of the company was largely dependent on the clinical asset that we had ahead of it in the pipeline. And it was necessary to scale back some of the work on the preclinical program and prioritize those resources. So, I think you have to be willing to sacrifice or delay something that you might be interested, even if it's not in the top priority of the company at that point. And I know that can be really tough to do, especially if you're very passionate about a project. But I've seen companies that almost become like a real life version of the Hunger Games, where everybody is cutthroat for resources. They want to fund their program, and it really creates a toxic environment. But if you lead by example and you show people, especially on your team, that you're willing to sacrifice aspects of what you may be working on or interested in for the benefit of the broader mission, I think they find it easier to buy in as well. We talked a little bit about helping people to find their voice. I think that's really important, both as a scientific and people leader, to help people gain confidence, providing opportunities to them. Maybe the last thing that I think of with this question is that there are, I truly believe there are a lot of good drugs out there that have failed, not because they don't have activity, but because a lack of team execution. And, we talked about this already, but if you look across successful companies, the strength of the team is always the thing that stands out. And a poorly functioning team with poor leadership can just sink a program that might have otherwise succeeded. So, in the end, it really comes back to building that strong culture where people feel valued, supported to grow. And all that translates to really better achieving the common mission of helping to benefit patients.
That's a great insight, and it's great. It's interesting to hear that and I've heard this before, that there are probably some really good drugs that could be available if they were executed better upon. That's unfortunate, but it goes to show you how important the leadership is around what that drug discovery and or drug development process looks like. This was great, Jay. I mean, I really appreciate all of your insight on leadership and on the industry. And getting your story really on how you've come up through the ranks. Anything else you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah. I really believe this is an exciting time for the life sciences industry, especially companies that are harnessing AI. We're able to support things like drug discovery and clinical design, or, finding biomarker patients for your trials, or mining large data sets. I think these companies are really succeeding. I think we're going beyond these traditional modalities to be able to target nodes that have been traditionally hard to target. We're seeing really nice partnerships, I think, in the industry, especially, in the diagnostic industry, for example, to match large data sets with drug developers to better get things to patients. And we're taking a lot of innovative approaches to get these new treatments to patients faster than ever before, especially in rare diseases, which I think is a strong unmet need. With all that said, I also very much know and acknowledge it's been a tough time, especially in terms of fundraising and hiring over the last year in particular. I think at least I've started to see, and hopefully you have as well, some signs of improvement, especially around the fundraising, around partnerships, the emergence of new companies. So I'm cautiously optimistic this will continue in 2026, and we'll see a bigger uptick in these areas and hiring in particular. But hopefully everybody can hang on and continue to try to move these things forward. So I really appreciate the time today, Chris, and the great conversation. So thank you.
Awesome, Jay. Thank you. It was great having you. And I agree. I am also cautiously optimistic on what's ahead over the next couple of years. Thank you so much for joining and being a guest.
Thanks for listening to Talent Therapy with Chris Tamburini. This show is for entertainment purposes and is copywritten by Ronan Vance, LLC.